Hi and welcome to the Deployment Research YouTube channel, a companion to the Deployment Research blog. My name is Johan Arvidmark, and in this video you will learn how to install and configure PowerShell deployment, or Psd as we call it. So what is Psd? Well, I'm happy that you asked. The shortened version is it's an extension to MDT that replaces all the VB script code with PowerShell and makes MDT support cloud imaging, deployment over internet, deployment over HTTPS. We also added in support for using driver packages as WIM files because it's simply much more effective to download a single file over internet compared to, say, a package with 1,000 small files. We added also in peer-to-peer support through branch cache, and the entire project is an open source project. It's available for download on github.com/friends of MDT. But before moving on, I cannot go any further but saying my biggest thank you to our active contributors. Over the years, we have a lot of people attending or working with the project, but these four gentlemen stand out. We have George and Elias has been instrumental in doing code review, testing, and being part of weekly meetings for a very long time. We have Dick Tracy, who is the mastermind behind the new modern wizard or deployment wizard, as well as some of the new background code we have in the project. And last but not least, Michael Nystrom, the lead developer for the entire project since the past 3.5–4 years. Thank you, everyone. This has not been or would have not been possible without your assistance. Now, Psd doesn't require too much. It basically have the same hardware requirement as MDT does. So you need to have a VM with MDT and ADK installed. That VM can be hosted on your network, in Azure or in Amazon. It doesn't really matter. Recommend to have at least 2 CPUs on it and at least 4 gigs of memory, but it doesn't hurt to add in a little bit extra, especially if you start to do a more advanced customizations, adding in databases and whatnot to the mix. From a network firewall point of view, obviously, you need to have HTTPS port or 443 open, otherwise you won't be able to connect to it. If you do use the optional monitoring feature, you also need port 9800 and 9801. But let's dive into demo, shall we? It is demo time. I'm going to jump over to one of my servers here. So this particular server is a Server 2019. It's standard edition. So if I do a WinVar here, this is what we have. This one is currently in a workgroup mode. Often when you set up deployment servers in Azure or Amazon, you set up them in a way so you are depending on any domain. But the solution does work even if your deployment server happens to be part of a legacy Active Directory domain. But this one is not. The server is named MDT1. And it's in a workgroup. In addition, I have downloaded some software to this machine already. So if I go to the setup folder here, I have downloaded MDT. I have downloaded a WIM file of Windows 10 21H2 in this case, or rather, I downloaded the ISO and then I extracted the WIM file from it. I've downloaded ADK for Windows 11 21H2. This is the version I currently recommend, even though there are 22H2 has been released. It has been plagued with a few bugs, so I have been actually staying away from it for a bit. So this is the version I recommend for now. Now, we also need to get the toolkit down. So open up my favorite browser, one of them, and go to the project on GitHub, Psd, and simply download a zip file of the project. It's not too big, coming down very quickly. 300 some kilobyte, but I will right click that one, unblock it, and then I just can extract the content to a folder here, and then I will move over this entire folder to where I have all the other stuff. So move it over here, call it Psd, and why not put in the version number as well so you have an idea of what version you're playing around with. Now, there are some things you need to do before we can run the actual Psd installer. So first of all, I have on my system, as you can see, I have a C drive and an E drive, and it's going to work primarily on the E drive here. So I'm going to go ahead and install MDT first. And you do not need to install the MDT hotfix for BIOS and UEFI detection because we are not using that code in this project. It doesn't hurt if you need it, but it's not required here. So I'm just running through the base MDT install. Then I'm gonna go the same thing with the ADK. So I'm running the ADK setup. Default location. Going to select the normal deployment components. That one is completed. Perfect. Now, since I have these guys installed, I can now run the Psd installer. When playing around with this for the first time, I highly recommend that you create a new deployment share with it, even though the product can upgrade an existing MDT deployment share as well. Just please be aware that if you do, it will actually go ahead and replace the existing scripts in that platform, and any existing sequences that you might have in that deployment share will now stop to work. So I do recommend to create a new deployment share. So I'm going to open up a regular PowerShell prompt. Bump up the font size a little bit. Go to the E drive. Try to go to E drive if I can type correctly. E drive. Go to Setup. Go to Psd. And in the root of this folder, this is where you find the installer. So install Psd. You have to specify where you want to deployment share. So I'm going to call my Psd production. And I'm going to give it a share name. And this is simply because MDT still uses deployment shares or the share name in the deployment share. We don't need it for anything we do because we are going to use a virtual directory in IS instead. And I'm going to give that the same name. In this case, I'm going to do a lowercase. And I will try to spell production somewhat right. Alright, that's all. Run the installer. Go through fairly quickly. Now, if I open up the deployment workbench, you will see that I have a normal MDT deployment share being created by the installer, but it's empty. So no applications, images, sequences, nothing in it, no drivers. If you look at the folder structure behind the scenes, you can see that this one looks different compared to a normal deployment share. All the VB scripts are now PowerShell scripts instead in here. So we have to add a few things here. I'm going to add in an application just to have one. So I'm going to add in one of my favorites. It's going to be Notepad++. I believe it's 846. I have those files in a folder here. And that's okay for a folder name. And I'm going to use the command line. I'm going to borrow the name of the app. And go ahead and show file name extensions. And the silent installer for this one is actually a capital S. If you do a lowercase s, it will not work. So now I have an application in MDT. I'm going to add an image. You don't have to create folders here, but I typically recommend it for some sort of organization. So I'm going to create the Windows 10 folder. And I'm going to import my Vim file that I had. So custom image, specify the location. This is where I have it. This can be any Vim file. It can be a thin one, it can be a thick one, anything in between. MDT really don't care, and Psd doesn't either. So I'm gonna copy that one over. That name is good as any. And it will now add a Vim file into the platform. Beautiful. Now, I'm gonna give it a better name. I'm not too big of a fan of the default naming convention here, so something like this will do just fine. Then I'm going to add some drivers to the mix, and we're going to need drivers for WinPE and for Windows. Psd is designed to use the total control method for drivers, meaning that you have one driver package for each model for each operating system that you deploy, or operating system family, I should say. So one for Windows 10, one for Windows Server, 2016, 2019, 2022, one for Windows 11, stuff like that. So I'm going to create two folders here. One for WinPE, 64-bit. And then I'm going to create a folder structure for my Windows 10 drivers. So new folder, Windows 10 x64. And then I'll start adding some drivers. So start with WinPE, import, browse to a folder where I have a few WinPE drivers, just some network and storage drivers, and I will add those in. Perfect. Then I need some drivers for my two models that I want to add in. So if I go to setup here, you can see I have some drivers for two different HP models. So I'm going to borrow that name because that is the model name. And I'm going to put that one here, or create a folder here with that name. And I'm going to repeat that process with the other model. Then I'm going to go ahead and import each drivers or each model to the right folder. So I will import drivers here for this model. That model is done. I'm going to go ahead and import the next one. That model completed. Now, to make sure that MDT doesn't inject more drivers than it should into the boot image, I recommend that you create a selection profile, because that one will act as a filter. And that was not the selection profile. Let's actually do a selection profile. WinPE 64-bit. And I'm going to select that folder acting as a filter. Come back to that in just a little bit. Now we can go ahead and create the sequence that I almost created before. I'm going to create a folder here for the same reason as I did the folder in operating systems. I'm going to create a sequence for Windows 10. Give it an ID of sort and a name that makes sense. And the important part here is now to pick one of the new templates. The other MDT templates, default ones, will not work once the deployment share has been extended. So I'm going to pick that one. I'm going to select my image that I added. Don't need anything here. And I'm going to go ahead and create the sequence. Now, since I added drivers based on OS family and model only, it's quite common that you also have OS and then vendor and then model. but I happen to know that these two are HP, so I don't need that folder. But that's really, you can use any structure you like, as long as the sequence matches that. So in the sequence, the step that injects the drivers, we have a driver path variable. This one is new in Psd. So I'm gonna simply remove the old make that is there, so it only says Windows 10 64% model %. Because as long as we have a match between this name here and what we have in the sequence here, it will work. So to speed up the process a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and currently disable the default Windows Update step. The image I'm using is already somewhat up to date, so I'm good there. But I am going to add in and say that, you know what, I would like you to install the application that I created. So I'm going to select my Notepad++ app, and I'm going to put in that as a name here. So now I have a sequence that installs Windows, injects drivers, and installs an application in the end. Now, in order for MDT to support imaging, we need to add in a web server. And in the installation kit, or in the installer, in the download, the repository, we have some scripts that help you do that. So, not entirely sure why I closed the other window before, but here we are. So go back to the setup folder for Psd, and I'm going to go to the tools folder. So we're going to install IS and WebDAV, and those components actually require a reboot. So we have a single script that just does do that install. New Psd web instance. It's going to add those components, and then it's going to ask me to reboot the server after that. That one is completed. I need to do a reboot. I'm going to close the Workbench, and I'm going to restart this machine. Alright, log in again. So now we have IS in place, or at least installed. But as you can see, we have not yet any virtual directories here. So I'm going to run this second script that works on IS that we have. Go to the setup folder, tools, and this would be the set Psd web instance. We have to specify the deployment share, or deployment folder, which was Psd production in my case. And I have to specify the name of the virtual directory. I'm gonna call mine Psd production, lowercase. Done. So if I go back here now and refresh, you can see I have a Psd production virtual directory. Now we also need a certificate, and this can either be a normal certificate, web service certificate from your internal PKI infrastructure. It could be a certificate that you buy for a web server, but we also include a self-signed CA or a setup of a self-signed CA that you can configure in the environment, and that is perfectly good for lab and test and just verify that thing works. So again, in the tools folder, we have a script that sets up a standalone root CA. Simple as that. You have to give it a name. So I'm simply going to call mine Psd root CA. It needs a expiry date. I'm going to 20 years on this one. And then I need to specify the deployment share, because it's going to actually export that root certificate and add to my deployment share, so it gets automatically added to the boot image. So if I run this and go back to my production deployment share, you will see that in that folder that you saw in PowerShell resources certificates, I now have that cert that I created, that root cert. Now I also need to create a certificate for the server, and we have another script for that, and that is this one here. So new Psd cert or web cert, server cert, English Johan. Alright, this one has a few parameters as well. We need to specify the DNS name. I'm going over the name of the server here, easy enough. I need a friendly name for it, not required, but it's helpful. I'm going to use the same friendly name. I need an expiry date. I'm going to do 2 years on that one. And then we have the root CF friendly name. It should be created from, and that's going to be the PSD root CA that I created earlier. So, looks good. I'm going to run it. And now if I open up the local cert store, so certlm.msc, you will now see that I do have a certificate for this server, and it is trusted by this one here that was created. So this is this one, and this is the server one. Now, if I go to bindings in IIS, right click here, edit bindings, you can see that the script also added in HTTPS, and it connected it to this certificate. So that part is done. We have a web server certificate that we can use. The next part is to do some changes to the deployment workbench or the deployment share. First of all, I told you about the WinPE drivers, so I will go Properties. I will go to Windows PE 64-bit, and I'm going to configure its drivers to use drivers from that selection profile only. And since I'm using that as a filter, you should select this option here, because that also allows you to add in other drivers that may be needed in WinPE. Network and storage are like the 99% of them, but there are other scenarios where you have to add in like on-screen keyboard drivers. It could be a video driver for a remote management platform. It can be a mouse driver, for example. HP servers, they're older ILO cards. They sometimes require a new driver, but this works for me. And I'm going to click OK. Now, you can, of course, edit all the settings, bootstrap ini, custom settings ini, as always, directly through the deployment share properties here. Now, I prefer to do that differently. I prefer to do that through Notepad++. So I'm going to go to my deployment share. I'm going to start with bootstrap in it. And here I'm going to add in a few things. So something that we added in this release was the ability to actually have multiple deployment shares specified, so it can fall back to a different server. The good old deploy root value still works, but you can also use this one here. So I'm going to put that one in. And I'm going to call it HTTPS and the server name. /Psd production. Now, I do recommend to have some sort of security into this mix. So you usually create a normal or a local user account. So MDT for build account, give it a password. Never expires. Perfect. Great. I have a user. Now, if you don't specify any usernames here, it's going to go ahead and prompt you for a username and password. But if you want to have it fully automated, of course, you can go ahead and specify them here. So just to save some time, I'm going to copy and paste from a different server that I have, where I already added in those. So this one here. Go back. Paste them in. This server is MDT01. Password is this one. I'm also skipping an initial welcome wizard that we enable in the product too. So that looked pretty good to me. I'm going to save that one. I'm going to open this one next. And I'm going to modify this one a little bit. So in this case, I will put in an admin password that I want to have in the environment. Otherwise, you can see there is a variable for the new wizard. One of the wizard themes. We support 4 of them, but this is the one we've been testing the most. And I think it's the best one. These are all traditional MDT variables. This is used for an optional upload feature through bits that we support as well. And these are just regular regional settings. So I'm going to save that one. And since we now have created the deployment share, added in all we need, created a web server, created a certificate, the last piece is to simply update the deployment share. Boot image has been created, drivers injected. Means if I go to the boot folder, we'll have a Vim file that you can add to your Pixel server, or an ISO file that you can boot, for example, on a virtual machine, or copy the content onto a bootable USB stick or make a bootable USB stick of it. Now, before we can start the deployment, I mean, obviously in a virtual machine it will work without drivers, but I told you that we added support for Vim files for driver packages. They will be created here, and we will extract them out of the out-of-box drivers here. So, to generate those Vim files, you go back to the tools folder, and you run the Psd driver package script. You specify the deployment share, or deployment folder, because you could have multiple. And you specify the compression type. If you don't specify any, it's going to do Vim by default, but we also support zip if you want to work with zip. It's just that the Vim file is the better type to use for branch cache in general, and it's fast because it doesn't need to be basically when blocks or changes in Vim files, it's only the delta that has to be downloaded over the network, whereas a zip file is less effective in that matter. Alright, done. Go back to the structure. I now have a folder for this Vim file here. And if I open that with 7-zip, you can see that this is indeed the content for that model. And the other folder here contains a Vim file for this model. So again, much more effective to work with, but this is where we have those driver packages. Now, the only thing that is remaining to do is to go to the boot folder here and copy the ISO over to my host. And I can do a test deployment. I will go to virtual machine, this one here, gonna configure it to use the ISO file. And I'm gonna boot it. Boot on the ISO. PowerShell deployment starts. What you see here in the background is done by BG Info, and we are simply putting basically text on it that we update in real time here. As you can see, it's trying to connect to HTTPS, MDT 01, etc. And it now starts the wizard. Click next, next, pick a sequence, gonna give it a better name, PC007, admin password, some language settings, summary, and off we go. And from now on, this is a regular task sequence running, but every time the sequence steps are calling from the original VB scripts, there is a replacement in the backend that simply forwards it to our PowerShell scripts instead. It's now applying the OS. Rebooting back into Windows for the first time. And once it logs in, it will continue the sequence automatically. Sequence starts again, now in full Windows. Installing the Notepad++ application. Deployment successful. I check the start menu. Sure enough, we have Notepad++. Looks pretty good. End-to-end deployment over HTTPS from an MDT server, extended with Psd.